The knock on the tall iron gate came just as Edward Hale, the gruff Millionaire CEO with a reputation for cold efficiency, was adjusting his tie in the mirror of his immaculate foyer. He wasn't expecting visitors, certainly not at 7 in the morning. His world was one of sharp boardrooms and high-rise apartments, not the sleepy suburban street he had reluctantly moved into for peace. Yet when he opened the gate, there stood a little girl, thin arms wrapped around a duct-taped backpack, shoes worn to the sole, hair tangled from the wind. She tilted her chin and asked softly, almost too bravely, "Will you walk me to school?" For a man who had spent years avoiding emotional entanglements, the question landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything he thought he understood. Her name was Sophie. He learned, and she lived in the weather-beaten house 2 doors down. The windows of her home were clouded with condensation. The porch light flickered, and when she shifted the strap of her backpack, he saw the fabric fraying where someone had tried to stitch it back together. Her smile was small, uncertain, but her eyes were steady, as if testing whether he would laugh or slam the gate. Instead, Edward rubbed the back of his neck and muttered, "Why me? Don't you have someone else?" She shook her head. "Mom's working early. And the other kids. They don't want me around." Her voice cracked just slightly on the last word. Edward glanced at the gleaming car in his driveway, its polished surface reflecting a man who had built empires but could barely look at a child without discomfort. He almost said no, almost. But something in her gaze, lonely yet unbroken, stopped him. So they walked. The contrast was striking, his pressed suit, polished shoes, and leather briefcase swinging at his side, while she shuffled along in sneakers with holes near the toes, holding her patched backpack like armor. She skipped once or twice nervously, then glanced up at him. "You don't smile much, do you?" she asked with blunt curiosity. He huffed a dry laugh. "Not really my thing." She nodded as though she understood perfectly. Re-hook. Halfway to school, Sophie tripped on a cracked sidewalk. The worn sole of her sneaker caught, and her books spilled out, a math workbook with dog-eared pages, a crayon drawing of a woman in a waitress uniform with "Best Mom" written above it, and a single sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Edward crouched, picking up the sandwich with care. It was thin, 2 slices of white bread and a smear of peanut butter, nothing else. He glanced at her. She looked away quickly, cheeks burning. He wanted to ask if that was all she had for lunch, but the words stuck. Instead, he tucked the items back in her bag, his polished cuff brushing against the duct tape that held the zipper together. At the school gate, Sophie whispered, "Thanks." She hesitated, then added, "Will you? Maybe tomorrow too?" He opened his mouth to refuse, but what came out was, "We'll see." He watched her walk into the swarm of children, her small figure swallowed by laughter and chatter that didn't include her. He felt something twist inside, a discomfort he couldn't shake. That evening, Edward stood by his window, sipping scotch. From across the street, he saw Sophie's mother return home in a faded waitress uniform, hair pinned back messily, posture bent with exhaustion. She carried a grocery bag so light it sagged flat. Through the thin curtains he glimpsed their kitchen, an empty fridge door hanging open, the dim bulb flickering above it. Sophie sat at the table, kicking her feet, trying to show her mother the drawing from her backpack. The woman smiled faintly, but her eyes carried shadows. The next morning, Sophie was there again at his gate, waiting with the same hopeful gaze. Edward cursed softly under his breath, but found himself falling into step beside her. She chatted about her teacher, about how she wanted to be an artist someday. Her words were bright, but her eyes held something heavier. "Do you ever get scared?" she asked suddenly. He raised a brow. "Scared of what?" She shrugged. "Of being alone." He nearly tripped on the question. For all his millions, the empty penthouse, the silent dinners, the long nights staring at spreadsheets, he knew that fear too well. He didn't answer. She didn't push. But that day when he returned from work, he found Sophie sitting on the curb outside her house, hugging her backpack. Her mother's car was gone. The porch light flickered above her head. She looked up at him and said, voice trembling now, "They turned the power off. Mom said it'll be back, but it's dark in there. I don't like it." Edward's throat tightened. He glanced at his own house, lights blazing, warmth spilling onto the manicured lawn, and then back at her shivering figure on the curb. The distance between them suddenly felt unbearable. He cleared his throat, searching for words, but none came. She whispered again, quieter this time. "Will you sit with me until she comes back?" And for the first time in years, Edward Hale set down his briefcase, loosened his tie, and sat on the cold curb beside a child who had nothing but courage left to give. Edward sat there on the curb, stiff at first, shoulders drawn as if someone might spot him out of place. Sophie leaned against her backpack, hugging her knees, eyes fixed on the patch of sidewalk between them. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint buzz of the faulty streetlight overhead. After a while she whispered, "You don't have to stay. You probably have better things." Edward exhaled slowly. "If I had better things, I'd be doing them. I'm here." She glanced up, surprised by the weight in his voice. For the first time she smiled, small but real. That smile disarmed him more than any boardroom ambush ever had. When her mother finally came home, cheeks flushed from the chill, waitress uniform stained from a double shift, she paused at the sight of Edward on the curb. Her name was Claire. She was striking in a way exhaustion couldn't hide. Sharp cheekbones, graceful movements even in weariness, hair twisted up haphazardly as strands framed her face. She looked at him with guarded suspicion. "Everything all right here?" Edward cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how absurd he must look. Millionaire CEO in a bespoke suit sitting cross-legged on the concrete. She just didn't want to be alone. Claire's throat tightened. She pressed her lips together, then bent to kiss Sophie's forehead. "Thank you," she murmured, though her tone carried more wariness than gratitude. She guided Sophie inside, the flickering bulb above the doorway casting uneven shadows. Edward stood brushing dust from his trousers, strangely unsettled. Rehook. The turning point came days later when Edward received an envelope by mistake. The postman had shoved it into his box, but the name belonged to Claire. The envelope was bright red, a final notice. Utilities. Past due. His chest tightened as he handed it to her later that evening. She froze, her fingers trembling as she took it. "They'll shut the heat off next," she whispered, more to herself than him. Sophie stood nearby, biting her lip, clutching that duct-taped backpack like it was all she had. Edward had built his fortune by ignoring emotion, by focusing on numbers and leverage. But now numbers looked different. They weren't profits and losses. They were heat or cold, food or hunger. He surprised himself by saying, "Let me help." Claire bristled, chin lifting with quiet dignity. "We're not a charity case." "I didn't say you were." His voice was calm but firm. "I said let me help." She hesitated, conflict flashing across her face, then finally whispered, "Why would you?" Edward didn't have an answer. He was ready to admit that Sophie's question about loneliness had cut deeper than he wanted to confess. Instead, he said, "Because sometimes people should, and because you've clearly done everything you can." That evening, he arranged for an anonymous payment to clear the bill. When the heat clicked back on in their house the next day, Sophie ran outside in excitement, telling him, "It's warm again. Mom said angels must have helped." Edward only managed a half smile, the kind he hadn't worn in years. Over the following weeks, their unlikely connection grew. He walked Sophie to school more often, listening as she rattled on about her drawings and dreams. He found himself lingering by Claire's porch, sharing brief conversations. Her exhaustion laced with wit, her resilience a kind of beauty he couldn't ignore. He noticed the way she brushed hair from her face with quick, practiced motions, how her voice softened when she spoke to Sophie, even if her eyes carried storm clouds. Then one cold morning, Sophie asked the question that forced everything into focus. "Mr. Hale, do you think families can choose each other?" He stopped mid-step, briefcase in hand, tie neat as ever. The question clung in the air. "Sometimes," he finally said. "Sometimes they do." The final shift came on a rainy Friday night when Edward found Claire outside her house, shivering as she tried to tape plastic over a broken window. Wind whipped at her thin sweater. He stepped forward without thinking, slipping off his tailored coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. She startled, then met his eyes. For a moment the world hushed, the rain, the cold, the distance between their lives. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, voice cracking. He swallowed, rain dripping from his hair. "Because I don't want either of you to feel alone anymore." The words landed, fragile, yet undeniable. Claire's eyes glistened, and Sophie, peeking from the doorway, smiled through the dim glow of their once flickering light. In the weeks that followed, Edward quietly funded Sophie's school meals, arranged for Claire to interview at a friend's company, and even fixed the roof through contractors who never mentioned his name. He never flaunted it. He simply showed up again and again until showing up felt like the only thing that mattered. And one crisp morning, when Sophie tugged his sleeve outside the school gate and asked, "Will you still walk me tomorrow?" Edward finally let the corners of his mouth lift into a true smile. "Every day you want me to." The story was never about wealth or poverty alone. It was about the courage to notice, the strength to step closer instead of looking away. For Edward, kindness didn't erase loneliness, but it built a bridge. For Claire, it meant dignity preserved in the face of hardship. And for Sophie, it meant she could walk into her classroom each morning believing she wasn't invisible. One act of generosity had rerouted all their lives. And that was enough to prove that even the coldest gates could open when someone dared to knock.